Alright, let's get into it. If you're new here, do us both a favor, hit that subscribe button. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss a single part of this deep dive. And honestly, drop a comment, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing this little community stretch across the map. Now get comfortable. Maybe turn the lights down low. We're stepping back into a world where trust was a luxury and your next meal could be your last. Let's talk about the day-to-day life of a king in the Middle Ages. You'd think it was all feasts and power, right? Wrong. The single safest thing a medieval monarch could eat was nothing. Seriously, because the royal kitchen wasn't a place of culinary art. It was a biohazard zone, a disaster waiting to happen where every smiling servant and every bubbling pot was a potential murder weapon in disguise. These cooks weren't just preparing dinner. Half the time, without even knowing it, they were conducting low-level biochemical warfare. Walk into that kitchen as the most powerful man in the kingdom, and what hits you first? The smell. Not of delicious spices, but of meat boiling for way too long, bread that kissed the fire a bit too passionately, and that one fish that had clearly given up on life weeks ago. The head cook would swear it was fresh, which in medieval terms meant they'd picked the maggots off. And that's before anyone even tried to kill you. To get a bite of food from the plate to the royal mouth, kings used tasters. Sounds like a fancy title, doesn't it? Very official. Until you realize the job description is basically, hey, eat this mystery meat stew, and let me know if you die. It's the only career where surviving lunch counts as a major performance win. This guy would bravely sample every single dish. If he was still standing and smiling an hour later, the king would dig in. If he wasn't, well, the king would order takeout. And by takeout, I mean more soup, but from the other cook, the one who looked slightly less like he wanted to stab you. But here's the thing. These rulers weren't just being dramatic. This paranoia, it was earned. Poisoning wasn't some rare, exotic crime. It was basically the national pastime for ambitious nobles. Why go through all the hassle of a war? The marching, the spending, the actual effort, when you could just slip something funky into the royal afternoon porridge and call it a day. Take King John of England. The history books strongly suggest he poisoned at least one of his rivals. And honestly, that tracks. This was a guy who was petty enough to lose the entire crown jewels in a swamp. Poisoning a cousin was probably just a boring Tuesday for him. Over in the Byzantine Empire, they turned food-based assassination into a competitive sport. Courtiers traded poisons like kids trade baseball cards. Some emperors barely even bothered ruling. They'd just show up for dinner, clutch their guts dramatically, and let the next guy in line deal with the paperwork. Even the church wasn't safe. More than one cardinal had a strangely convenient death right before a big election. The official record would blame the will of God, which was the medieval way of saying, do not ask what was floating in that communion wine. So yeah, the kings were paranoid. But honestly, they probably weren't paranoid enough. Every single meal was a live conspiracy theory. Every bowl was a threat. Every spoonful was a cliffhanger. In medieval Europe, staying alive wasn't about courage or strength or some divine blessing. It was about having a food taster who genuinely liked you. Now, beyond the castle walls, medieval folks had two big fears. First, anything that moved in the woods after dark. And second, anything that moved in the woods after dark while singing. And that second fear leads us straight to one of the era's favorite stories. Secret pagan cults hiding in the forests, doing forbidden rituals under the moon, probably barefoot and definitely in need of a bath. Villagers whispered about them. The church swore they were real. Even the local barn cats probably had opinions. And the weirdest part? This particular conspiracy was absolutely true. But before you picture dark-robed sorcerers summoning demons, get a more realistic image. Think of a handful of exhausted, dirt-poor peasants sneaking into the woods to hum old songs, burn some herbs, and desperately pray that this year's crops don't fail again. Life back then was brutally hard. You spent half the year starving and the other half just trying not to die from the weather. If lighting a weird candle in a clearing and whispering to some old, forgotten spirit made you feel just a tiny bit more in control, you were going to do it. And they did. These groups weren't evil. They were more like underground support groups, but with better incense. The church, of course, saw it differently. Anything not officially stamped with a papal seal was automatically a satanic plot. Enter the forest cult hunters. These were priests who'd march into the woods armed with torches, holy water, and absolutely zero wilderness skills. Most of the time, they'd trip over a root, scream at an owl, and run home claiming they'd scared off a demon. But sometimes, just sometimes, they'd stumble on something real. A stone circle the locals still used. Bundles of herbs burned in strange patterns. Symbols carved into trees that were older than Christianity itself. They'd find a small group of peasants who really didn't want to talk about their weekend hobbies. The most famous of these groups were the Benandanti up in northern Italy. These were people who claimed they left their bodies at night to fight witches and protect the harvest. And the crazy part? They truly believed it. When the church interrogated them, expecting demonic confessions, they got what sounded like medieval Avengers fan fiction instead. Then you had the forest healers, usually women, who knew which herbs could cure a fever or which salve could heal a wound. They used moonlight, whispered chants, and generations of knowledge. Herbalism itself wasn't a crime, but being good at it, suddenly that was devil magic. So the whispers were right. Medieval Europe did have secret pagan groups meeting in the shadows of the trees. They weren't monstrous. They weren't evil. They were just deeply committed to not letting the church harsh their vibe. While villagers kept one eye on the haunted woods, they probably should have kept the other on the local monastery. If you grew up thinking of monks as quiet, peaceful guys who just copied books and baked bread all day, I've got some news for you. Some of those guys, they were basically the CIA in robes. See, while the common folk prayed and the nobles schemed, the monasteries were running a very different kind of holy operation: information gathering. And yeah, that's the polite medieval term for spying. The church was the biggest, most connected institution in Europe. It needed eyes and ears everywhere. And who made better spies than monks? They were literate, they moved around a lot, and they were already trained to watch for human sin with the focus of a hawk. They traveled between abbeys, collecting gossip disguised as confession, and they wrote everything down in those neat, beautiful manuscripts. You could call them historians, but a more accurate job title would be intelligence analyst with fantastic handwriting. The real masters of this game were the Dominicans. Their whole order was built on hunting out heresy, which meant they were pros at interviewing people, intercepting letters, and just watching, a little too closely. If a medieval man sneezed at the wrong part of a sermon, a Dominican friar would materialize out of thin air to ask some very specific follow-up questions. These monastic travelers had the perfect cover. They could move freely across kingdoms, carrying messages nobody dared to inspect because who wants to risk hell for bothering a man of God? Plenty of kings quietly paid monks to be their eyes and ears, reporting back on court scandals, army movements, or whether Duke so-and-so was planning a suspiciously large dinner party. It was like a medieval subscription news service, but for secrets. Things got even more intense with the Inquisition. Suddenly, the church had a whole department dedicated to digging up incriminating info. Monks would interview suspected heretics, grill the locals, and write down the juiciest rumors to send up the chain of command. Some reports were serious stuff, talk of rebellion or hidden pagan rites. Others read like the medieval version of a tabloid. Brother Gregory reports the blacksmith's wife was seen carrying suspicious herbs after midnight. Possible witch. Needs more surveillance. Not every monk was a spy, of course, but enough were involved that regular people started to notice. Villagers whispered that the monasteries knew everything about everyone, and they weren't wrong. A monk could walk into a town, buy a loaf of bread, ask 3 innocent-sounding questions, and suddenly know more about your marriage troubles than you did. So yes, that conspiracy was real too. Behind the chanting and the candle smoke, medieval monasteries operated a quiet, continent-wide web of secrets and surveillance. And unlike most things in the Middle Ages, this system actually worked pretty well. Turns out, the most dangerous weapon back then wasn't a sword or a crossbow. It was a monk with a sharp mind and a really good memory. Now, if you asked your average medieval person what the Knights Templar were up to, they'd probably lean in and whisper something like, oh, guarding ancient treasure, hoarding secrets, worshipping a creepy severed head. controlling kings, threatening the Pope, running the banks, summoning a demon or two. Normal knight stuff. People back then loved a wild conspiracy, and the Templars were their favorite subject. The best part? Some of the wild stories were actually based on truth. The Templars started as a small, noble group of knights sworn to protect pilgrims. Very heroic, very holy. But then they got hit with a terrible curse. They became wildly successful. Within 100 years, they were so powerful that kings had to schedule their nervous breakdowns around them. The Templars owned castles, huge tracts of land, entire fleets of ships, and more money than half of Europe's kingdoms combined. They were like a medieval mashup of the Navy SEALs, the Federal Reserve, and that weirdly intense club your neighbor is always talking about. And with great power comes great, juicy rumors. People said the Templars guarded a legendary treasure. And on that one, Europe was actually right. They invented the first international banking system. A pilgrim could deposit money in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem, which felt like futuristic magic to people who still got nervous about their own reflections. The Templars kept their accounts in complex codes, operated vaults more secure than castle treasuries, and moved money with an efficiency that made kings nervous and tax collectors furious. Then you had their secret rituals. They met in private, held ceremonies after dark, and swore oaths no outsider could hear. Naturally, everyone assumed the worst, that they were worshipping a mysterious idol named Baphomet, which is just medieval for, we have no idea what they're doing in there, so let's assume it's awful. The truth was way more boring. Their rituals were mostly about internal discipline, confession, and their own rules. Dull administrative stuff. But medieval minds couldn't handle dull. They needed drama. And oh, did they get it. King Philip IV of France was permanently broke and really good at blaming others. He decided the Templars were heretics, which was basically his way of saying, I want your stuff. He had them arrested, tortured, and forced to confess to things so ridiculous they make modern internet conspiracy theories look tame. But here's the twist. Philip wasn't entirely wrong. The Templars did have a massive treasure. They did run a secretive financial empire. They did keep knowledge from the public. It just wasn't demonic knowledge, it was banking ledgers and military codes. But in medieval Europe, being that good with numbers was basically its own form of witchcraft. So the Templars were victims of lies and slander, but they were also guilty of being too powerful, too secretive, and too rich for their own good. Their real crime wasn't devil worship. It was having a really, really good accounting department. When the Black Death rolled into Europe in 1347, it didn't just bring death. It brought chaos, terror, and a desperate need for someone to blame. People scrambled for answers. What was causing it? How did it spread so fast? Why did it seem to love crowded cities and men who thought bathing was a once-in-a-lifetime event? Most folks landed on the usual suspects. Demons, bad air, or their neighbor's weird-looking pig. But one particularly nasty theory took root and spread faster than the plague itself. The idea that the church knew more than it was letting on. And the really disturbing part? This time, the conspiracy theorists had a point. The higher-ups in the church, the pope, the cardinals, the bishops, they had access to information regular people could only dream of. Medical reports from doctors in Italy, letters from merchants in port cities, logs from ships coming in from the east. They knew when outbreaks were tearing through trading hubs. They knew when major roads were turning into pathways for death. They knew whole monasteries were being wiped out overnight. So while peasants were still in their fields, scratching their heads and wondering why their cousins suddenly broke out in terrifying boils, bishops were quietly packing their finest robes and moving to their countryside villas. For the fresh air. To be fair, medieval clergy weren't scientists. Half of them thought sickness came from an imbalance of bodily fluids, and the other half figured it was just God being a little miffed. But they had one huge advantage: information. And in an age where news moved slower than a snail carrying heavy groceries, information was absolute power. There are records of bishops ordering city gates shut right before a plague wave hit, without giving a clear reason. Monasteries would bar their doors from the inside. Church officials sent each other coded letters with phrases like, "The ship brings dark tidings," which was basically their way of saying, "Stay inside. the world is ending. Even the quarantine orders looked suspicious. Some were issued before the sickness had visibly reached an area. That means someone somewhere knew it was coming. Merchants wrote about getting strange warnings from church contacts, telling them to avoid certain ports a week before those places became death traps. That's not a miracle. That's insider trading with lives. Meanwhile, what was the official advice given to the panicking public? Repent. Pray harder. Burn some sweet-smelling herbs. And my personal favorite, avoid excessive joy. Yep, being too happy was officially considered a plague risk. The Middle Ages were truly committed to the grind of suffering. So, did the church intentionally hide the truth to hurt people? Probably not with straight-up evil intent. But they absolutely played things close to the vest. They prioritized their own safety, withheld warnings to prevent panic, and basically acted like they had everything under control when they were just as clueless and scared as everyone else. In the end, the peasant's gut feeling was right. Someone did no more. They just decided not to share. Let's flip that image of the gentle, herb-growing monk on its head one more time. Because hidden among the holy men, the scholars, and the scribes, there were other kinds of specialists. Discreet problem solvers. Gentlemen who could recite scripture from memory and also make a political rival disappear without disturbing the morning prayers. I know it sounds like the plot of a bad TV show, but medieval Europe really did have cloistered assassins. These guys weren't monks because of some spiritual awakening. They were monks because it was crazy convenient. Joining a monastery got you food, shelter, legal protection, and a free pass to travel anywhere. Those robes were like an all-access backstage pass to the medieval world. And who was hiring these holy hitmen? The nobles, of course. The same crowd already trying to poison each other's wine. If a lord needed something done quietly, with zero witnesses and total deniability, he didn't send a knight. Knights were loud. Knights loved to brag. Knights would trip over their own armor and ruin the whole operation. No, he sent brother someone, the monk you didn't ask questions about. These were often lay brothers, the guys who did the manual labor around the monastery, not the delicate manuscript work. They had strong arms, few friends, and a perfect excuse for being on the road. I'm on a pilgrimage to collect alms for the poor. Nothing to see here except maybe the dagger very carefully tucked into that robe. The history books don't come right out and say these men existed, but they leave a trail of breadcrumbs. A noble dies in a way that's just a little too convenient. A political rival has a sudden, fatal accident. A stubborn landowner abruptly donates all his property to the church and then vanishes without a trace. You find monks writing letters complaining about brothers who lack spiritual discipline, which was monastery code for, "This guy keeps sneaking out at night and we don't know where he goes." There are even records of monks being caught with weapons, disguises, or letters they really shouldn't have had. None of them ever confessed, of course. A monk with a good poker face and the threat of holy wrath behind him was a tough man to break. Why did kings and lords tolerate it? Because monasteries solved problems. Efficiently, quietly, with no messy questions afterward. So yes, when villagers whispered that some monks were more dangerous than they looked, they were hitting the nail on the head. Behind the psalms and the incense, some monasteries housed men who could pray for your soul 1 minute and arrange for you to meet your maker the next. When we think of witch hunts, we picture the 1500s and 1600s, the big bonfires, the screaming crowds. But the truth is, the fear and the hunting started way earlier. Medieval Europe didn't need a manual to start panicking. They were already professionals. Long before it became an official craze, villagers talked in low voices about the wise women who gathered herbs by moonlight. These weren't cackling hags on broomsticks. They were the local healers, the midwives, the only therapists in town. They were the people you went to when you couldn't afford a real doctor, which was always because medieval doctors mostly just prescribed bleeding you until you passed out. These women knew which plants could cure a fever, which salve could heal a wound, and which tea could help with a difficult birth. Their knowledge was priceless, which immediately made the church side eye them hard. In the Middle Ages, knowing things you weren't supposed to was basically a crime. So the villages built their own conspiracy theory. These women were part of a secret network, sharing forbidden knowledge under the stars. Herbs were secret codes. Knotted cords were magic symbols. Their midnight gatherings were strategy meetings. And while it all sounds super dramatic, they weren't completely wrong. There were networks of healers. They did train each other and pass down dangerous knowledge in secret, precisely so the church wouldn't call them witches. But sometimes they screwed up. Sometimes a woman would cure an illness the local priest had prayed over for weeks. Sometimes she'd predict a storm more accurately than the almanac. Sometimes a love potion would fix a marriage, breaking about half the commandments in the process. Obviously, this meant they were in league with the devil. When livestock died, blame the healer. When crops failed, blame the healer. When your husband ran off to join the crusades to get away from you, clearly the healer put a spell on him. Beneath all the panic, the conspiracy theory held a tiny, twisted piece of truth. There really were secret gatherings of people practicing what everyone called magic. It's just that their magic was actually science, experience, and carefully grown rosemary. In a world drowning in superstition, simple competence looked supernatural. So medieval folks started hunting witches long before it was cool. They put them on trial in barns, questioned them by the river, and sometimes tried to drown them just to see if they'd float. These early hunts were messy, chaotic, and completely unprofessional. The bitter irony? The only witches who actually existed were the ones trying their hardest to keep everyone alive. And in the Middle Ages, that was the most suspicious behavior of all. Medieval kings loved drama. Big speeches, unnecessary wars, lavish feasts. And sometimes, if the mood struck them, faking their own deaths. Or, at the very least, letting everyone think they were dead. And get this, medieval people totally suspected this kind of thing. They gossiped about it in taverns. They passed the rumors down for generations. And in at least one famously messy case, the public's conspiracy theory wasn't far off. Let's talk about Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. This guy was so eccentric, so brilliant, and so weirdly ahead of his time that Europe literally didn't know what to do with him. He spoke 6 languages, wrote poetry, was obsessed with science, and kept a personal zoo. This automatically made him suspicious to peasants who thought any man who liked books was probably chatting with demons. Frederick's death in 1250 was a big, public, witnessed event. The church breathed a huge sigh of relief. Europe buried him. Everyone moved on. Except they didn't. Almost immediately, rumors started flying that Frederick wasn't really dead. He was just resting, hiding, waiting for the right moment to come back and reclaim his empire like some kind of medieval Batman, but with a better bird collection. Whole cults sprang up around the idea. People swore they saw him wandering through forests in disguise. Merchants told stories of a mysterious nobleman who paid with Frederick's old coins. A fisherman insisted the emperor himself asked for directions. Peasants claimed a hooded man at mass in Sicily had Frederick's exact posture, which is a seriously specific thing to notice unless you're completely obsessed. You'd write this off as typical medieval nonsense, but then things get weird. A man shows up centuries later in England calling himself Richard of Eastwell, claiming to be a secret son of King Richard III. Another suspiciously educated, suspiciously refined stranger with no past. He spoke Latin, knew royal manners, and had the posture of a man who'd never done his own laundry in his life. Historians still argue about him. In both cases, something feels off. Medieval rulers did occasionally pull disappearing acts. They'd stage dramatic exits, vanish for months, or swap identities to stay safe. And since record-keeping was basically, Bob wrote it down before he spilled ale on the parchment. Who could really prove anything? So the conspiracy theory stood on shaky, but seriously intriguing ground. Sometimes kings didn't die. They just got tired of the drama and retired in secret, letting everyone else clean up the mess. And honestly, who could blame them? If your life was a non-stop parade of plagues, rebellions, and poisoned soup, you'd think about faking your death too. Alright, let's pause right here. We're just getting warmed up. If this deep dive into medieval paranoia is your kind of thing, hit that like button. It really helps. And tell me in the comments, what's the wildest conspiracy theory you've ever heard about history? I read them all. Now let's get back to it. Because few things scared medieval Europeans more than something they needed every single day. Water. Water. It was the source of life and, just as often, the bringer of a horrible, gut-wrenching death. Nothing terrified a medieval village more than their own well, because water was unpredictable, could feed your family or wipe them out before sundown. So when people started getting sick, when livestock dropped dead, what did they do? They pointed at the well. The poisoned well's conspiracy spread faster than any gossip. A family gets a fever? The well did it. Your best cow keels over? The well's cursed. Your bread burns, your kid trips, the weather turns bad. Clearly, someone tampered with the water supply. The medieval mind had a very creative relationship with cause and effect. But underneath all that panic and shouting was a nasty little truth. Sometimes the wells actually were poisoned, not by witches or demons, but by the people next door. During a siege, poisoning a well was standard military strategy. Armies would dump dead animals, toxic plants, or just anything disgusting into the enemy's water source. Nothing says surrender now like hauling up a bucket full of dead rat. The siege manuals literally recommended it. Picture a military guidebook. Step 1, surround the castle. Step 2, build trebuchets. Step 3, sabotage their plumbing. But your average European villager wasn't reading siege manuals. So when mysterious deaths happened miles from any battlefield, they cooked up their own explanations. They blamed the usual suspects, outsiders. A traveler passing through? Probably a poisoner. A merchant selling strange herbs? Definitely a poisoner. Someone who looked like they could read? Don't even get me started. This fear turned truly dark during the Black Death. Towns, looking for a scapegoat, falsely accused Jewish communities of poisoning wells. It was a horrific lie that led to brutal violence. But it shows just how deep this conspiracy had drilled into the medieval brain. Water was life, but it was also mystery, and mystery was perfect fuel for fear. And here's the painful irony. Even in peaceful times, wells could turn toxic all on their own. Rain washed waste into them. Dead things fell in and rotted. Leaves fermented into a nasty, bacteria-rich soup. Most wells were just holes in the ground, shared by people who bathed once a year and thought illness was caused by bad stars. So, were wells poisoned? Yeah, sometimes. But mostly, they were poisoned by nature itself, by germs medieval folks would have called witchcraft. They scared each other silly over secret poisoners, while Mother Nature was doing most of the dirty work for free. When your whole world feels unstable, you reach for a simple answer. And in the Middle Ages, the simplest answer was always, the well did it. Medieval Europe had a weird fascination with identity crises. If a stranger wandered into town claiming to be a long-lost prince or a resurrected king, people didn't ask for ID. They threw a feast, argued about his family tree, and started sharpening their pitchforks just in case he was lying. This wasn't because they were naive, okay, they were a little naive, but because royal imposters actually showed up all the time. In a world without photos, without fingerprints, without anyone even spelling names the same way twice, figuring out who someone was came down to a group vote. Does he look noble? Was the background check. And looking noble usually meant having most of your teeth and not smelling like a barn. Take the strange case of Richard of Eastwell. The story goes he showed up in Kent in the 1400s, calm and quiet, hinting that he was the secret son of King Richard III. A huge claim, but then he'd do things no regular peasant could do. He read Latin. He wrote with beautiful handwriting. He knew how to hold a fork. He didn't flinch when people talked about taxes. Highly suspicious behavior. He never came right out and admitted it, but he dropped enough hints that people ran with it. Medieval England loved a good drama. Centuries later, historians are still scratching their heads over who he really was, because the details fit just a little too neatly. Record-keeping back then was basically done on whatever scrap of paper was handy, so the possibility remains deliciously open. Richard wasn't a one-off. Europe was crawling with resurrected royalty. There was Anastasia of Poland, who died young, only for several women to later pop up claiming to be her, complete with inside knowledge of the court and eerily familiar manners. Whole regions went to war over whether some woman was or wasn't a princess, because nothing says stable government like an army of men yelling, "That's her, I'm sure of it," when none of them have ever seen her before. And then there were the cases where the imposters weren't imposters at all. In times of trouble, some real rulers would flee, hide, or disguise themselves to escape assassination. A king in dirty commoner clothes wasn't a myth. It was a survival strategy. So every story about a mysterious stranger had a thin layer of possible truth underneath. The real problem was medieval politics loved a good plot twist. If a royal died under shady circumstances, which was basically every royal death, people immediately assumed the body was a fake, the death was staged, or the ruler was living under an assumed name somewhere, probably deeply regretting the whole being in charge thing. So yes, the conspiracy about royal imposters was huge. And it came true so often that Europe eventually stopped asking, "Is this even possible?" and started asking, "Okay, which cousin is pretending to be dead this time?" If you ever wondered what the medieval version of a forbidden library looked like, picture a small, dusty room deep inside a monastery, locked with 3 heavy bolts and guarded by a monk who looked like he hadn't smiled since the last crusade. Inside were shelves of books the church didn't want anyone reading, and villagers whispered about these places like they were filled with cursed objects. Here's the kicker. These forbidden book vaults were absolutely real. The church controlled almost all education. If you wanted to read, write, or do anything more intellectual than counting sheep, you went through them. So naturally, they also controlled what you couldn't read. Anything that threatened their authority, contradicted scripture, or suggested the earth did something scandalous, like move around the sun, got quietly pulled from circulation. But they didn't burn everything. Burning books is dramatic, smoky, and attracts peasants who ask annoying questions. Instead, they locked banned texts away in special archives with fancy names like Armaria or Scriptoria. Or, sometimes it was just that locked room Brother Thomas always looks guilty coming out of. What was inside? A surprisingly wild mix. There were heretical gospels with ideas that could get you interrogated before you could say Inquisition. There were works of Arabic science and medicine that were clearly correct, but annoyingly ahead of Christian doctrine. There were medical books discussing anatomy in ways that made bishops faint. There were even ancient pagan manuscripts that monks had secretly copied for research, which was code for, "I was curious and don't want to get in trouble." The best part? Church officials argued about these vaults constantly. Some believed this dangerous knowledge should be saved for future generations. Others thought it should be locked away forever because it asked too many awkward questions. Questions like, if this pagan astronomy text correctly predicts an eclipse, what else is it right about? Cue the loud coughing and sudden change of subject. These vaults weren't rumor. They were policy. When inquisitors seized the libraries of accused heretics, they didn't destroy it all. They cataloged it, studied it, filed it away. Knowledge, even forbidden knowledge, was power. The conspiracy existed because people sensed what was happening. They knew that somewhere in those silent monasteries were books that could change minds, challenge power, or reveal truths that medieval Europe just wasn't ready to handle. So yes, the villagers were right again. Behind the incense and the chanting, behind the thick oak doors, the church kept a carefully curated treasure trove of secrets. And like all treasure in the Middle Ages, the best way to protect it was to pretend it didn't exist. If there was one place in medieval Europe where conspiracy wasn't a theory but a daily business plan, it was Italy. Venice, Florence, Milan, beautiful today, but back then, they were like a high-stakes gangster movie with way better architecture. These city-states spent centuries pretending to be peaceful trading hubs while waging a silent, non-stop war of espionage, bribery, and back-alley diplomacy. For years, Italians whispered about a shadow conflict running underneath the official treaties and alliances. A hidden war of spies, saboteurs, and accidents that only ever happened to politically inconvenient people. The conspiracy sounded almost too dramatic. Unfortunately, every bit of it was true. Italian city-states were fiercely, hilariously jealous. If Florence made a fortune, Siena had an existential crisis. If Venice signed a sweet trade deal, Genoa threw a tantrum. If Milan built a tower slightly taller than its neighbors, a blood feud started that would last 3 generations. They competed in everything: money, art, fashion, and assassinations. Yes, assassinations were a point of civic pride. Out of this beautiful chaos grew one of the most sophisticated spy networks in the medieval world. Venice was the undisputed champion. Their government created an entire secret intelligence council that used coded messages, financial surveillance, and a network of spies sprinkled across Europe like paranoid confetti. Their enemies feared them. Their allies feared them. Even other Venetians feared them. Venice also had the famous Bacca di Leone, lion's mouth slots in the wall where citizens could anonymously drop notes reporting crimes, conspiracies, or that their neighbor was acting suspiciously Italian. A secret council would read them and decide who needed to be investigated, discouraged, or quietly disappeared. Italy didn't invent the deep state. It just gave it better clothes and better food. Meanwhile, Florence had its own spy ring, largely run by the Medici family, who were so rich they could probably have bought the truth and stored it in the basement. Florence specialized in bribery and shady banking deals. Milan was all about intimidation. Genoa was into naval sabotage. Siena was a master of pretending to mind its own business while absolutely not minding its own business. The result was a constant, silent war. No armies marching, just merchants going missing, letters getting rewritten, alliances breaking overnight, and treaties accidentally falling into the fireplace. So yes, the conspiracy theorists were right. Italy wasn't just fighting wars. It was fighting all the wars, but quietly, politely, and always with impeccable style. Long before modern thrillers talked about holy bloodlines, medieval Europe was already obsessed. The conspiracy was simple. Noble families were secretly descended from sacred or royal ancestors, and they were hiding the proof. Villagers whispered it. Nobles denied it. Chroniclers wrote it down with the energy of guys who loved gossip more than facts. And some of it was true. In medieval Europe, legitimacy was everything. You couldn't rule a pig farm, let alone a kingdom, without waving around a fancy family tree. But family trees back then were a mess. Affairs happened. Wars happened. The occasional mysterious baby showed up after a long pilgrimage. Everyone politely looked the other way, so nobles came up with a solution. Hide the embarrassing branches and inflate the impressive ones. Suddenly, half the noble families in Europe claimed they were descended from Charlemagne, a man who, if the math is to be believed, must have had about 4,000 children. Others claimed Trojan heroes, Roman emperors, or even King David as ancestors. Medieval genealogists weren't historians. They were creative writers with quills. But under all the nonsense, real hidden bloodlines did exist. Letters found centuries later revealed illegitimate royal children quietly placed in monasteries or distant country estates with the instructions: raise this child and do not ask questions. Some of these kids resurfaced. Some didn't. Some had descendants who found out, 500 years later, that great-great-grandma wasn't a simple peasant. She was the secret daughter of a duke with terrible impulse control. One of the juiciest examples involves the French Capetian dynasty, which secretly funneled money to certain noble houses for generations. Houses that were, coincidentally, connected to lost royal infants. English chroniclers wrote about hidden heirs living under fake names during civil wars, waiting for the right moment to reclaim the throne. A moment that usually never came. And then there's the church. Monks sometimes wrote annoyed notes like, "Another noble child has been entrusted to us. Origin unknown," which is medieval code for, "Someone dropped off a fancy baby at the door again and won't tell us who it belongs to." So, was there a conspiracy around holy bloodlines? Yes. But not because they were sacred. Because they were scandalous. Affairs, hidden heirs, swapped identities, political insurance babies, all tucked away behind thick castle walls. Medieval Europe didn't need a secret line from Jesus. It already had enough royal drama to last until the end of. When medieval Christians whispered about secret Jewish and Muslim networks operating under their noses, they imagined something sinister. Shadowy figures trading coded messages, plotting rebellions, a medieval Illuminati. Naturally, the church panicked, kings panicked, everyone panicked. But here's the twist hardly anyone saw coming. The networks actually existed, just not for the reasons everyone feared. They weren't planning world domination. They were planning survival. Jewish and Muslim communities faced constant persecution, heavy taxes, expulsions, or, on a really bad Tuesday, accusations of poisoning wells or summoning demons. So to avoid being wiped out, they created underground systems of communication and escape. Quiet, subtle, and absolutely not meant to overthrow anything except their own bad luck. These networks included safe houses, coded routes, sympathetic merchants, and doctors who traveled in disguise. Families fled across borders using prearranged signals. A lamp in a window, a mark on a doorframe, or a phrase like, "Is the pomegranate harvest good this year?" Which really meant, "I need to get out of here now." Jewish communities maintained informal routes stretching from France to Spain. Muslim communities in Spain and North Africa ran escape paths across the Mediterranean. Compared to the clunky, slow-moving medieval governments, these networks were shockingly efficient. Of course, Christians saw this efficiency and thought, "Conspiracy!" The logic was painfully medieval. They keep surviving our attacks. That must mean they're plotting something. Better attack them harder. The irony is thick enough to choke on. Behind the hysteria, these secret systems saved countless lives. They preserved knowledge, protected families, and kept culture alive during centuries of fear. Some historians think they even laid the groundwork for later resistance movements. So yes, the conspiracy was real. But instead of planning the downfall of Europe, these networks were doing something almost unheard of in the Middle Ages. They were helping people. Officially, medieval Europe ran on feudalism. Kings, lords, peasants, a tidy pyramid of duty, tithes, and taxes that made no sense to anyone, especially the guys collecting it. That was the system everyone talked about, the one written in the fancy charters. But underneath that polished, dysfunctional surface, there was another system, a quiet, sprawling, totally illegal maze of deals, handshakes, and under-the-table agreements. Today, we'd call it the shadow economy. Back then, it was just how things get done, son. And here's the fun part. Everyone pretended it didn't exist while using it every single day. The conspiracy went like this. Gangs of thieves, smugglers, loan sharks, and creatively flexible peasants operated outside the law, forming networks that stretched across kingdoms. Secret trade routes, black market goods, illegal betting rings, all of it humming along in the alleyways from London to Venice. Medieval people believed in this underground economy. They told stories about it. They warned their kids about it. And they were absolutely right. Let's start with the thieves' guilds. Yes, they were a real thing. No, they didn't have matching uniforms. But they organized territories, settled disputes, and punished independent freelancers for stepping on their turf. Medieval law enforcement was so useless that criminals created their own HR department. Then you had the unofficial moneylenders. They operated in the back rooms of taverns, sometimes even in monasteries. Charging interest was a sin, unless you did it quietly and called it a donation for administrative services. These guys were the banks for people who couldn't go to a real bank. Smuggling was everywhere. Salt, wool, wine, iron, if it could be taxed, someone was sneaking it past the taxman. The king's tariff was less of a law and more of a polite suggestion everyone ignored. Whole villages would lose a shipment right before the collector arrived, only for those goods to magically reappear in Old Man Pietro's barn, who found them on the road. Even the regular markets had their conspiracies. Bakers hid cheap flour in their loaves. Butchers used weighted scales. Fishmongers swore their fish was fresh when it clearly died during the First Crusade. Everyone cheated a little, stole a little, and then nodded along in church like God hadn't just watched them shortchange 3 customers. So yes, the medieval shadow economy was real. It was thriving, and it was arguably the only part of the economy that worked consistently. The biggest conspiracy wasn't that it existed. It was that every single person, from the peasant to the priest, pretended they weren't a part of it. Now let's shift gears entirely. We're leaving the smoky taverns and paranoid castles of Europe behind. We're traveling to a place where night didn't bring fear, but a soft, deliberate kind of magic. Night in the city we're about to visit didn't just fall. It descended like a sheet of dark silk, soft and complete. But in one district, the lights were just coming on. This was the pleasure quarter, and it never truly slept. As the sun dropped behind the tiered roofs and merchants pulled their shutters closed, another world woke up. A world built not on laws or duty, but on sensation, artistry, and the delicate, expensive promise of escape. The lanterns were lit first, one by one, their flames trembling behind shades of lacquered red, gold, and pale jade. Servants carried them out on long poles, until the entire district glowed like a constellation that had fallen to earth and decided to stay a while, shimmering on the cobblestones worn smooth by 1,000 years of wandering feet. Walking under the first archway, you felt the city change behind you. The daytime clatter of commerce faded, replaced by the soft, deliberate pluck of a stringed instrument, the rhythmic tap of wooden blocks, and laughter, real, light laughter, drifting from behind silk curtains. The air here had a different recipe. It smelled of roasted barley tea, of honey melting into delicate pastries, of sandalwood incense, and the faint, sweet hint of plum wine. What made this floating world unique wasn't just its beauty, but the powerful illusion it sold. The sense that once you stepped inside, time itself loosened its grip. The endless, grinding weight of the day just slipped off your shoulders. Scholars, their minds aching from a day memorizing ancient texts, arrived to recite new, daring poetry. Government clerks, exhausted by bureaucracy, came seeking a few hours where no one demanded a form in triplicate. Even wandering monks would pause at the district's edge, watching quietly, as if observing a realm of temptation they were forbidden to enter. The streets twisted like painted ribbons, each turn offering a new scene. A puppeteer surrounded by wide-eyed children, a masked performer practicing impossible flips, the glimpse of a courtesan behind a gauzy screen, adjusting a hairpin with effortless grace. Everything was movement, music, and a quiet, humming anticipation, all held within a serene, dreamlike order. Visitors often said entering the pleasure quarters felt like stepping into a living painting, where nothing harsh, nothing hurried, could touch you. The laughter was gentle. The music was round and soft. The lantern light was warm enough to make every passing face look poetic. It was a world both utterly real and completely unreal, crafted to soothe the mind, stir the senses, and make every guest feel, if only for one evening, beautifully, perfectly weightless. And this, my friends, was only the beginning. If the entrance to the floating world was a soft breath, then its heart was the tea houses. They lined the streets like polished jewels, each with its own personality, but all sharing a sacred devotion to the art of refinement. Some were modest, with simple bamboo blinds and clay teapots. Others glowed with lacquered pillars, jade-green roof tiles, and carved screens depicting cranes in flight or scenes from famous operas. Together, they formed a glowing corridor of soft light and complex aromas, pulling you deeper into the night. Stepping inside was like stepping into a different kind of temple. The first thing you noticed was the smell. Toasted rice, chrysanthemum petals, the deep, earthy scent of aged tea bricks. Servers moved like water, gliding between silk cushions with trays of steaming cups, each arrangement a tiny masterpiece. Conversation here was a hushed, respectful murmur. Laughter was measured. These tea houses weren't just places to drink. They were listening rooms, social theaters, sanctuaries for wandering, tired thoughts. Scholars gathered to debate philosophy, challenging each other with verses scribbled on the spot. Aspiring officials, nerves frayed from imperial exams, tried to project calm. Merchants negotiated deals wrapped in layers of exquisite politeness. And soldiers, just passing through, sat in a silence they couldn't find anywhere else, simply savoring the peace. Yet the true soul of these spaces was the courtesans who performed within them. Unlike the women in other houses, these artists were celebrated for their mastery of subtlety. They recited poetry with a clarity that made each syllable hang in the air like a dewdrop. They painted calligraphy with brushes that seemed to breathe. They played the pipa, a pear-shaped lute, with fingers so deft the notes didn't seem to come from strings, but from the air itself. Their presence didn't dominate the room. It shaped it. Each movement was balanced, deliberate. Guests often felt the tea houses had their own secret rhythm, voices flowing like a quiet stream, music rising in gentle waves, the delicate clink of porcelain cups marking time like a slow, steady heartbeat. Some came for conversation, others came for the silence, but everyone left with the same feeling. Here, time didn't just slow down. It became gentle, as if it too wanted to sit and savor one more perfect cup. In the floating world, pleasure didn't start with desire. It started with a profound, costly calm, and the tea houses were its purest, most expensive expression. As the night deepened, a new sound began to rise above the murmur of the tea houses, the distant, exciting thrum of drums, the flutter of silk sleeves, the warm chorus of voices lifting from the district's many theaters. These weren't just buildings, they were portals. To enter a theater here was to surrender yourself completely to a dream painted in movement, color, and song. The buildings themselves were works of art. Some were simple wooden halls with open stages. Others rivaled temples, with carved rafters, dragon-headed beams, and facades telling ancient stories. Inside, lanterns hung in tiered constellations, casting a golden light that softened every edge and turned the audience into a sea of shadowy, expectant faces. Behind painted screens, actors underwent their transformation. Their makeup wasn't decoration. It was a mask into another soul, white powder to create a blank, otherworldly canvas, bold crimson to carve out emotion, ink-black lines that could shift a character's fate with just a flick of the eyes. The costumes were a riot of silent color under the lamplight. Robes of turquoise, imperial yellow, lotus white, and deep red, each stitch heavy with symbolism. The performances were a seamless blend of poetry, martial arts, dance, and music. A single sweep of a silk sleeve could convey heartbreak. The twirl of a sword could create tension like a sudden storm. Musicians sat to the side, plucking zither, striking wooden clappers, pulling long, trembling notes from bamboo flutes. Stories from 1,000 years ago breathed again. Generals torn by duty, spirits haunting the mortal world, lovers separated by honor, gods descending from clouds painted on silk. For the audience, the merchant, the scholar, the weary traveler, the theater offered the purest escape. For a few hours, ledgers, exams, and sore feet were forgotten. A well-told story could lift you out of your life and place you, gently, into another. When the last note faded and the lanterns dimmed, guests would emerge slowly, blinking, as if waking from a shared, beautiful dream. And stepping back into the glowing streets, the floating world itself felt more magical, as if the art had seeped into the very bricks and the night air. Now we're getting to the core of it all. Past the tea houses and theaters, in the quiet heart of the pleasure quarter, lived the figures who embodied its deepest allure, the courtesans. These were not mere entertainers. They were artists in the truest, most complete sense, trained from childhood in poetry, music, painting, conversation, and the subtle, unspoken art of emotional presence. To meet a renowned courtesan was to encounter refinement sculpted into human form. Their residences, known as flower pavilions, stood behind discreet, carved gates. Some were intimate, filled with soft cushions, shelves of inkstones, and vases where the blossoms were changed with the season. Others were grand, with inner courtyards, koi ponds, and moon gates that framed the lantern light like a living painting. Regardless of size, each pavilion carried a signature scent, a blend of fine incense, delicate cosmetics, and the clean smell of newly brushed silk. It was an atmosphere of tranquil, expensive anticipation. A courtesan's power began long before she spoke. Her appearance was a masterpiece, hair styled into elegant, impossible loops, smoothed with perfumed oils. Robes of silk in colors chosen to flatter, pale lilac, deep lake blue, lotus white, embroidered with threads of silver so subtle they only caught the light when she moved. And when she moved, the fabrics whispered. When she sat, her posture held the serene stillness of a deep lake. But their true art was expression. A courtesan could recite a poem with such clarity each word felt like a drop of rain. She could paint a line of calligraphy so fluid it seemed to ripple on the paper. She could play the pipa with fingers so deft you heard not strings, but the wind through a bamboo forest. Her conversation was a gentle rhythm, attentive, thoughtful, never rushed. Visitors sought them not for crude pleasure, but for a respite so complete it felt like healing. Scholars debated verses and left inspired. Officials, worn thin by politics, found solace in their patience and wit. Young nobles, restless and unsure, felt steadied by their quiet confidence. A single evening with a great courtesan could feel like a sanctuary where every burden you carried simply melted away. Yet beneath that flawless elegance was an unspoken truth. This life demanded insane discipline. Their refinement wasn't effortless. It was a fortress built with relentless devotion. And for those lucky enough to cross their thresholds, the experience was unforgettable. A moment suspended perfectly between reality and dream, held gently in the most graceful hands imaginable. All right, let's shift gears again, and shift them hard. We're leaving behind the whispers of medieval courts and the silk-lined tranquility of the floating world. We're stepping onto the sun-baked, dust-choked roads of the ancient world, following the most ambitious campaign in history. When you picture Alexander the Great, you see the battles, right? The thunder of cavalry charges, the unbreakable wall of spears, the dust of Gaugamela. But none of those legendary victories would have been possible without something far less glamorous, yet infinitely more impressive: the logistical machine that trailed behind him like a silent, monstrous shadow. His army didn't just march across continents because they were brave. They marched because every single step was calculated, because the supplies never stopped flowing, because the system, against all odds, actually worked. From the moment Alexander left Macedonia in 334 BC, he wasn't just leading an army. He was commanding a moving city, a city of nearly 40,000 men. This city stretched for miles when on the march, soldiers, cavalry, engineers, siege experts, doctors, blacksmiths, cooks, scribes, interpreters. Behind them came thousands of animals. Mules, camels, pack horses, each one a walking warehouse loaded with tools, food, spare weapons, and medical supplies. This army had no trucks, no radios, no engines of any kind. Yet it coordinated movement across some of the most brutal terrain on Earth with a precision that modern militaries still study with respect. Alexander inherited a smart system from his father, King Philip, but he refined it into an art form. The army traveled light, insanely light for its size. A regular soldier carried just the essentials: his weapons, his armor, a cloak, a few days of grain in a sack, and usually a simple cooking pot. Tents? Those were mostly for officers. The rank and file slept under the stars. This wasn't about comfort. It was about speed. The less they carried, the faster they moved. And for Alexander, speed was a weapon as deadly as any spear. But movement was only half the miracle. The real magic trick was supply. Alexander understood a fundamental truth. Fuel, food, water, fodder for the animals was just as critical as bronze and iron. His scouts rode days, sometimes weeks, ahead. They weren't just looking for enemies. They were mapping every well, every stream, every village with a grain silo. Local cooperation was negotiated before the army ever arrived. If a region couldn't support the troops, the route was changed. If grain was needed, caravans were organized. If the land was barren, rations were tightened and marches were shortened to conserve energy. This wasn't just planning. It was a careful, relentless choreography. It made Alexander's army something almost unnatural for its time. A force that could move like a ghost, strike like lightning, and survive in environments where other armies would simply starve to death. The logistics were invisible to most, but they were the heartbeat, the silent engine, the only reason a young king could take one army across deserts, over mountains, through empires, and never, ever let it collapse under its own weight. Feeding 40,000 men wasn't a challenge. It was a crisis that had to be solved anew every single day. Alexander's commanders knew this better than anyone. A soldier could fight without sleep. He could march on bleeding feet. But without food and water, the army would dissolve. Discipline would vanish. and the unstoppable momentum of the greatest campaign in history would just stop. So before any battle, any glory, any moment of legend, there was grain. Tons of it. Hauled, bought, bargained for, or taken. The backbone of the army's diet was barley and wheat. Each man needed about 2 pounds a day. Do the math. Multiply that by tens of thousands. Then add the cavalry horses, the pack animals, the herds of cattle they drove along for milk and meat. The numbers become staggering, a nightmare of consumption. Alexander solved this not with giant stockpiles, which would have slowed him to a crawl, but with constant, aggressive acquisition. His quartermasters were as important as his generals. They rode ahead, cutting deals with towns and villages. They'd negotiate for grain, fodder, salt, dried meat, livestock, all of it to be delivered to a specific point on the army's route at a specific time. When diplomacy failed, the Macedonians foraged. And this wasn't some haphazard looting. It was an organized military sweep. Units fanned out in a radius around the marching column, systematically gathering every edible thing in their path. But Alexander preferred to keep the locals happy. Burn a village today, and there's no food tomorrow. Secure its loyalty, and your supply line just got a little longer, The cavalry was an even bigger headache. A single warhorse ate as much as 10 men, and Alexander had thousands of them. Grasslands determined his route as much as any enemy formation. In barren regions, herds of sheep and cattle became a living, breathing, walking supply line. But the ultimate dictator of movement was water. On the march, the army would often move at dawn, pushing hard to reach a known river or well by noon, before the heat became a killer. Scouts identified water sources days in advance. A single wrong report, a single dried-up well, could mean dehydration and death for thousands. Alexander treated supply not as a boring administrative task, but as an invisible battlefield. Winning this battle meant his men stayed strong. Losing it meant the end of everything. Every day the army marched, the supply officers fought their own war. One measured not in enemy dead, but in full grain sacks, in healthy hoofprints, and in the precious, life-giving sound of water flowing right where it was needed. Now, let's talk about the real enemy. It wasn't always the Persian army. More often, it was the ground beneath their feet. Terrain was both Alexander's greatest ally and his most relentless foe. Roads, mountains, rivers, deserts, mountain passes, they shaped the campaign more than any general's brilliant plan. Alexander understood this instinctively. He treated the land the way a master sailor treats the wind. Something to respect, to use, and to never ever underestimate. The Macedonian army moved along routes chosen with obsessive, almost paranoid, precision. Scouts and engineers went ahead, studying the ground like detectives. Could a column miles long pass here? Was this road too narrow, too muddy? Would that river be fordable or a death trap? A single wrong choice could snarl the entire army and leave it exposed. Time and again, Alexander avoided disaster by altering a route by just a few miles. A tiny adjustment with massive consequences. Crossing mountains was a special kind of hell. The Balkans, the Taurus Range, and especially the Hindu Kush tested the army to its absolute limit. Narrow passes forced men to march single file. Cold turned their weapons brittle. Snow blinded the horses. Avalanches could wipe out whole units in an instant. Yet Alexander planned each climb with a chilling, mathematical calm. Breaks were scheduled at sheltered ledges. Firewood was gathered in advance. Pack animals were redistributed to prevent deadly pileups. Reserves of grain were saved specifically for these brutal climbs. The deserts were worse. The Syrian steppe, the fringes of Mesopotamia, the Gedrosian desert. This was warfare without an enemy. The enemies were heat, thirst, and a disorientation that could break the strongest mind. Movement here depended entirely on one thing: prior intelligence. Local guides captured scouts, nomadic traders. They were interrogated, bribed, or hired. Their knowledge of a single hidden well or a shaded valley was worth more than gold. A wrong direction here didn't mean a lost battle. It meant a mass grave. Even open plains required skill. The army marched in flexible blocks, keeping the vulnerable supply trains protected. Engineers improved roads on the spot, leveling earth, laying down planks over marshes. Where there was no bridge, they built one. Where a river was too wide, they used rafts, ferryboats, or captured ships. Every crossing was a construction project executed at military speed. Movement wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was the core of Alexander's strategy. By mastering the land, he mastered time itself. He arrived weeks before his enemies thought possible. He struck where they believed no army could go. The terrain didn't slow him down. It amplified him. And that, more than any sword or spear, is what made his campaign feel utterly unstoppable. We're making a hard turn now. From the disciplined march of Alexander's army, we're plunging into the chaotic, roaring, suffocating heart of ancient Rome itself. Forget marble columns and orderly forums. We're going downtown, to the Subura. The Subura didn't greet you. It assaulted you. It hit you in the face with a wall of noise, a punch of smell, a chaos of humanity so thick it felt like stepping into a different, louder, dirtier planet. Just a few steps away from the respectable districts with their temples and law courts, the contrast was so violent it might as well have been a different city. Behind you, marble, order, quiet dignity. Ahead, a sprawling, steaming maze of taverns, brothels, workshops, and rickety apartment blocks that leaned over the narrow streets like drunken giants about to collapse on top of each other. The first thing that hit you was the sound. The Subura never, ever slept. Even at dawn, the streets throbbed with shouted arguments, the shriek of cartwheels on stone, kids screaming as they chased rats through the gutters, and prostitutes calling down from balconies. Vendors yelled prices for everything: stale bread, dubious sausages, lamp oil, cheap wine. Blacksmiths hammered metal right in their doorways. Beggars sang horrible songs or just wailed for coins. And over it all, laundry lines crisscrossed between the towering buildings like sad, grimy flags in the thick Roman air. The smells came at you in layers, each one worse than the last. With smoke from 1,000 cooking fires, the greasy scent of fish stew perpetually boiling, spilled, sour wine, the sharp, ripe sweat of 1,000 unwashed laborers, the wet clay smell from the potter's shop, and underneath it all, the ripe, undeniable stench from the open gutters that served as the city's sewer. It wasn't pleasant, but it was alive. The Subura was the roaring, beating, bleeding heart of Rome's working class, a district where life was loud, fast, cheap, and constantly on the razor's edge of total chaos. The buildings were nightmares. They rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high, thrown up cheap and fast by landlords who cared more about rent money than human lives. Fires were a weekly event. Collapses happened. Families of 10 crammed into single rooms lit by one smoky oil lamp. Freed slaves, immigrants, street performers, gladiators, criminals, and the just plain desperate all lived stacked on top of each other, layered above storefronts that never closed. You could buy anything in the Subura: a meal, a stolen necklace, a forged will, a quick romance, protection, or a kind of trouble you didn't even know existed. The streets themselves were narrow, twisting, soaked in shadow. They felt like they were watching you. Stray dogs darted between your legs. Pickpockets moved like ghosts. Drunks slept in doorways while loan sharks stalked the alleys, looking for their money. Every corner held a secret or a threat. To the rich senators up on the hill, the Subura was Rome's shame, a boil on the city's face. To the poor who lived there, it was home. To a lost traveler, it was overwhelming, terrifying. But to Rome itself, it was absolutely essential. This is where the empire's muscle lived, where its real gossip was born, where its true, unfiltered pulse beat the loudest. Walking into the Subura meant stepping into Rome's raw, unvarnished, ugly truth. If the Subura had churches, they weren't made of stone. They were made of cheap wood, cracked clay, and smoke-stained beams. These temples were the taverns, the true gathering places, the real seats of power in the district. Drinking houses stood on every corner, squeezed between butcher shops and brothels, glowing with lamplight 24 hours a day. They were always packed, always deafening, always one insult away from a brawl. Inside, The air was so thick you could chew it. Smoke from cheap oil lamps mixed with the steam from vast, bubbling pots of mystery stew and the sour, permanent reek of old wine soaked into the wooden counter. Patrons sat shoulder to shoulder on rough benches, shouting over each other, slamming clay cups, laughing, arguing, scheming. A Subura tavern wasn't just a place to drink. It was a marketplace for stories, rumors, insults, and opportunities. Cheap, watered-down wine flowed like the Tiber in flood season. The stronger stuff, imported from the provinces, was available if you knew the right word to whisper and had the right coins. The food was fuel, not cuisine. Bread dipped in garlic oil, bowls of gritty lentils, greasy sausages sizzling on an iron plate, fried fish from the river. It was meant to keep a laborer on his feet for another back-breaking day, not to delight his senses. The tavern owners knew their clientele. They had posts driven right into the bar to chain up the really troublesome drunks. Heavy-set bouncers lounged by the door, ready to throw a thief into the street. Prostitutes moved from table to table, offering a smile, a conversation, or more, if the price was negotiated. Gamblers huddled in corners, tossing knucklebones, crowds gathering as voices rose over every roll. Above all, the tavern was Rome's gossip engine. News traveled faster here than a senator's courier. If a politician had embarrassed himself, the Subura knew the details before he got home. If a gladiator had refused to fight, they were whispering about it over watered wine. If a merchant's daughter had run off with a soldier, the Subura had the full, scandalous report within hours. Drunk men loosed tongues, and the tavern keepers remembered every secret they spilled. Fights broke out constantly, over an insult, a stolen purse, a bad dice roll, or just because it was Tuesday. Violence here was routine. The crowd would part, fists would fly, and then, as quickly as it started, it would stop. Someone would buy a round to smooth things over, and life would stumble onward. In the Subura, taverns weren't a distraction from life. They were the loud, smoky, crowded soundtrack of life itself. This is where Rome's forgotten class laughed, bled, plotted, and survived. When the sun finally dipped behind Rome's 7 hills, the Subura didn't calm down. Transformed, the daylight chaos sharpened into something darker, more deliberate, and far more dangerous. The oil lamps flickered to life, throwing long, dancing shadows that made the crooked streets feel like a cave. And from behind painted doorways and beaded curtains came a new sound, the soft, inviting murmur and bright, practiced laughter of Rome's oldest profession. The brothels of the Subura came in every flavor. Some were just a single miserable room behind a tavern, a mattress on the floor and a curtain for privacy. Others were multi-level establishments run by sharp-eyed Leanie, madams who knew how to handle drunk clients, bribe the right officials, keep peace between rival pimps, and squeeze the last copper out of a man who swore he was broke. The fanciest brothels might have a mosaic on the floor or perfume in clay jars, with women and men dressed in fine linen. But even these luxury houses were still Suburan at their core, loud, smoky, and humming with a tense, transactional energy. The workers themselves were a map of the empire's misery. Some were slaves, working off a debt or simply following their owner's orders. Others were freedmen or freedwomen who'd chosen this over hauling bricks or scrubbing floors because the coins were better, if not the conditions. A few were runaways, fugitives, or people discarded by their families, surviving the only way they could. They came from Greece, Syria, Egypt, Gaul, every corner of the conquered world. The Subura was a brutal melting pot of accents, languages, and desperate hopes. Little painted signs by their doors served as advertisements. A sandal for a woman, a phallus for a man, a mask for a variety show. Patrons lined up in dim corridors, coins in hand, haggling loudly. Inside, the mood could swing from playful to melancholy to brutal in a heartbeat. The madams had rules to keep the peace, but in a place like this, violence was always simmering just under the surface. And yet, the brothels weren't just about sex. They were intelligence hubs. Soldiers, loose-lipped from wine, bragged about upcoming deployments. Merchants whispered about shady deals. A politician's bodyguard might seek discretion, paying for silence with extra coin or a valuable piece of gossip. A single night's work could expose a secret worth a fortune. The workers listened, and they remembered that knowledge made them valuable, gave them a shred of power, and occasionally kept them alive. Walking past these places at night, you'd hear a jarring mix: thumping music, muffled shouts, sudden peals of laughter, shadows moving faster than the lamplight could catch. The Subura's night economy wasn't hidden in shame. It was the district's lifeblood, pumping openly through its veins. Here, vice wasn't a moral failing. It was business. It was survival. It was the Subura. If daylight showed the Subura's poverty, the night revealed its teeth. Crime here wasn't a lurking possibility. It was a fact of life, as regular as the sunrise. It walked the same streets, breathed the same air, and moved through the alleys with a practiced, chilling ease. The Subura was so notoriously lawless that even the city guard, the urban cohort, would only patrol in large groups, and never after dark if they could help it. The thieves were the first layer. Pickpockets, especially children, were artists. They slipped through crowds like eels, their small fingers tugging at belts, slipping into purses, slicing bags open with tiny, sharp knives. The smart ones worked with distractions: a staged fight, a collapsing beggar, a spilled basket of fruit. While all eyes turned, your money vanished. Getting robbed in the Subura wasn't bad luck. It was an inevitability. Then came the burglars. At night, they became ghosts, moving across the rooftops, slipping through open windows, or prying weak shutters loose. The insulae, those rickety apartment blocks, were perfect targets. Dozens of families crammed into flimsy rooms with no way to secure their few pitiful belongings. A skilled burglar could hit a dozen homes in a single night. Many of these criminals didn't work alone. They belonged to gangs, loose, brutal collectives bound by profit, not loyalty. Gangs controlled territories. Some ran protection rackets, demanding payment from shopkeepers to avoid accidents. Others specialized in gambling dens or the slave trade. A few acted almost like twisted neighborhood watches, solving problems for a fee. But most were volatile, prone to bloody infighting and betrayals. Their turf wars, fought with clubs, knives, and fists, could erupt without warning, turning an alley into a battleground. The authorities were practically useless here. The urban cohorts knew the terrain favored the locals. The maze of dead ends, the rooftop escape routes, the sheer number of hostile eyes. To enter deeply was to risk ambush, humiliation, or a knife in the back. When they did come, it was usually enforced to break up a riot or collect a body, not to prevent crime. In the Subura, justice was a private matter. Thieves were beaten by mobs. Troublemakers were convinced to leave. Gangs negotiated their own truces. Information was the most valuable currency of all. Who was carrying money? Who owed a debt? Who was new and vulnerable? Secrets didn't last long here, and survival often meant knowing when to keep your mouth shut. Yet, for all its peril, the people adapted. They walked with purpose. They kept their coins hidden in their fists. They memorized which corners to avoid. The Subura didn't ask for your moral judgment. It demanded your total, constant awareness. In a place where criminals lived door to door with carpenters and washerwomen, the one universal truth was this: the shadows owned the night, and the night here was very, very long. Beneath the noise, the crime, and the grime, the Subura had another, often forgotten, identity. It was the engine room of the Roman Empire. This district wasn't just thieves and sex workers. It was home to tens of thousands of honest laborers, the men and women whose sweat and exhaustion literally kept the lights on and the water flowing in the world's greatest city. If Rome ate, built, manufactured, hauled, cleaned, or repaired anything, odds were high it passed through the calloused hands of a Suburan worker. At dawn, long before the taverns closed, the laborers emerged. A river of exhaustion flowing out of the insulae. Men carrying baskets of tools, bricks, clay pots, and ropes. Porters headed to the markets and docks to haul sacks of grain, heavy amphorae of wine and oil. Builders marched to construction sites, chisels and mallets in hand, ready to carve stone or mix mortar under a blistering sun. Carpenters, metalworkers, leather tanners, and cobblers opened their tiny storefront workshops. The air inside already thick with the smell of sweat, burning charcoal, and raw materials. The women worked just as hard, maybe harder. Many spent dawn to dusk washing clothes in public basins, grinding grain at millstones, weaving wool, or selling vegetables from a street corner blanket. Some cooked simple meals to sell: porridge, bread with cheese, boiled chickpeas, keeping other laborers fed for a coin. Children worked too, fetching water, tending fires, or shouting prices to attract customers. In the Subura, work started early and ended late because stopping meant starving. The craftsmen were the district's silent backbone. The constant clang of the blacksmith's hammer shaping iron tools was the soundtrack of progress. Potters spun clay at wheels by their doorsteps. Shoemakers stitched sandals for soldiers, slaves, and senators alike. Every trade imaginable existed here, from barbers shaving faces right on the street to scribes penning letters for those who couldn't write. Despite the dog-eat-dog atmosphere, a raw, practical solidarity existed. Neighbors shared food when someone fell sick. Women watched each other's children. The water carrier might give an exhausted worker a drink on credit. It wasn't kindness out of softness. It was necessity. Life here was too hard, too brittle to face completely alone. Money was always terrifyingly short. Most residents lived from one meager wage to the next, in a constant, grinding battle against hunger, rent, disease, and the oppressive crowd. But what the Subura lacked in comfort, it made up for in a raw, stubborn resilience. Every face told a story of survival. Every workshop spoke of a skill honed by desperation. Every dawn revealed a district that, despite its vice and violence, kept Rome fed, clothed, and moving. The Subura wasn't pretty, but it worked, and the glorious, marble-clad Roman Empire worked only because the Subura did. If the streets of the Subura were chaotic, the buildings that created its infamous skyline were where the true danger lived. The insulae, Rome's tenement blocks, they loomed over the district like a stack of badly made boxes, 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high, leaning at terrifying angles, groaning in the wind, swaying under the weight of human desperation. These weren't homes built with care. They were investments built for speed and maximum profit. The landlords wanted rent, not happy tenants. The result was some of the most lethally dangerous living conditions in the ancient world. The moment you stepped inside an insula, you felt the crushing pressure of life packed into too little space. The ground floor was usually shops or yet another tavern, filling the lower air with smoke and noise. Above that, a narrow, treacherous staircase spiraled upward. It was steep, uneven, and dark even at noon. Most residents carried a small, precious oil lamp to avoid a misstep, because one slip on those stairs could mean a broken neck. The rooms themselves were tiny, often just a single, airless chamber for an entire family. Furniture was minimal. A straw-stuffed mattress, a wooden stool, a few clay bowls. Maybe a curtain for a shred of privacy if you were lucky. Kitchens were almost unheard of. People cooked on small, open braziers, filling their rooms with smoke and making fire a constant, sleeping terror. A single spark could climb the wooden skeleton of the building in minutes, turning an insula into a funeral pyre for hundreds. Water was a daily struggle. Only the luckiest buildings had access to a courtyard fountain. For most, it meant hauling heavy buckets up and down those deadly staircases, multiple times a day, trying not to spill a single precious drop. Night brought a profound, smothering darkness. Lamps and oil cost money many didn't have. Countless families simply sat in the near black after sunset, conserving their strength and their resources. Privacy was a joke. Noise traveled through the wafer-thin walls as if they weren't there. You heard every argument, every crying baby, every drunken song from the tavern below, every footstep of the stranger living above you. The insulae never knew silence. They pulsed instead with a low-grade communal misery. And yet, within these vertical slums, a fierce, pragmatic community was forged. Neighbors shared scraps of food, watched each other's kids, passed on warnings about the landlord's thugs. They lived stacked in layers, a literal cross-section of Rome's struggling underclass. Freedmen, immigrants, laborers, widows, runaway slaves. Dangerous, overcrowded, unstable. The insuli were the harsh, grimy truth behind Rome's gleaming marble facade. In the Subura, life didn't just happen on the streets. It happened above them, in these rickety towers of want, where survival meant adapting to a world built upward, because there was nowhere else to go. If the Subura had a pulse, you'd feel it strongest in its street markets. From the first gray light of dawn until long after the stars came out, the district transformed into a living, shouting, bargaining organism. Every alley, every scrap of open ground, every set of steps became a trading floor where coins changed hands faster than insults. This wasn't the polished, colonnaded marketplace of the Forum. This was commerce stripped raw. Mud, sweat, sharp elbows, and pure survival. Vendors arrived in the dark, dragging two-wheeled carts or bent under the weight of baskets hanging from wooden yokes. They claimed their spots with the aggression of seasoned soldiers, arguing over inches of prime space. By the time the sun hit the rooftops, the smell of the district had already shifted. Roasting chestnuts, boiling lentils, the sharp, salty stink of preserved fish, sausages and onions sizzling over coals. Hungry workers crowded around food stalls, shoving breakfast into their mouths as they stood, already late for a day of brutal labor. The food was cheap, simple, heavy. Bakers sold flat, dense bread still warm from communal ovens. Fishmongers laid out the morning's catch on wet planks, the scent attracting a cloud of flies and hungry, hollow-eyed children. Greengrocers shouted prices for wilted leeks, wrinkled olives, and hard chickpeas. Women with tired faces ladled porridge into cracked clay bowls for a single tiny copper coin. If you had a little extra, you might find a luxury. A honey cake, a date from some far-off province, a cup of spiced wine. But those were for rare treats, for days when luck briefly smiled. Beyond food, the Subura streets were a sprawling, open-air warehouse. Leatherworkers displayed belts and sandals. Tinkers had bronze pots and patching tools laid on blankets. Barbers set up stools right on the cobblestones, shaving customers amid the flowing gossip. Fortune-tellers read palms next to herbalists selling dubious remedies for headaches, heartbreak, or a bad debt. Performers, jugglers, flute players, men with dancing monkeys, drew crowds that choked the entire street. The noise was the physical force. Vendors shouted in Latin, Greek, Syriac, Egyptian. Buyers haggled with a ferocity born of knowing every coin mattered. Children shrieked. Dogs barked. A chicken would escape its cage and cause pure, feathery chaos. And somewhere in the middle of it all, always, a thief's practiced fingers were at work. But these markets were more than just commerce. They were the Subura's social network, its news service, its town square. Women traded the latest gossip as they felt vegetables for ripeness. Men debated gladiator matches over cups of sour wine. Off-duty soldiers flirted clumsily with stall-keepers. News didn't travel here. It erupted. A political scandal, a mysterious death, a rumor of war. The Subura markets knew first, and they spread it faster than any crier could hope to. Here, survival was a high-stakes art form. Selling, buying, bargaining. It required instinct, grit, and a thick skin. The market wasn't just where you fed your family. It was where you proved you could still fight for them, one shouted negotiation at a time. No district in Rome lived closer to the edge of oblivion than the Subura. Here, disaster didn't need an invading army or a rebellion. It could spark from a knocked-over cooking fire, a drunken bet gone wrong, a rumor that hit the wrong ear in a crowded tavern. And when disaster struck here, it struck with a terrible, hungry finality. The Subura was infamous for three things: fires, riots, and a deep, mutual hatred between its people and the authorities who were supposed to protect them. Fire was the oldest, most feared enemy. The insuli, built of cheap timber, dry plaster, and crammed with flammable lives, were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. A single overturned oil lamp, a cooking brazier kicked in the night, and hell would climb the wooden staircases like a ladder. Flames leapt from apartment to apartment in minutes. Smoke, thick and black, filled the narrow streets long before the sleeping families inside knew their escape was cut off. There was no fire brigade, just buckets, wet rags, and raw panic. Neighbors became frantic rescuers, bursting into burning rooms to drag out children, haul the elderly down collapsing stairs. Sometimes the urban cohort would arrive with axes to tear down walls to create a fire break, but more often, they just watched a city block become a screaming, roaring funeral pyre. And then, from the ashes and grief, people would rebuild, because they had nowhere else to go. Riots were just as common. Crowded poverty, constant hunger, and the simmering threat of violence made the Subura a pot perpetually at a boil. If a landlord raised the rent, a mob would gather. If a corrupt official demanded one bribe too many, the response was a hail of stones and broken pottery. If two gangs clashed over territory, a street could turn into a war zone in a heartbeat. Tavern brawls bled into alleys. Festival nights, with their drums and torches and too much cheap wine, often tipped into pure chaos. The city's authorities were terrified of the Subura. The urban cohorts patrolled rarely, and never in small numbers. Politicians told their own guards to avoid whole streets. To enter the Subura unprotected was seen as a death wish, even for a hardened soldier. The people, in turn, trusted the authorities less than they trusted the rats. They saw them as outsiders, tax collectors, enforcers of rules written for the rich. The Subura handled its own justice. Thieves were beaten by crowds. Troublemakers were given a one-way trip to the Tiber. Gangs negotiated truces without a magistrate in sight. And yet, in the very teeth of disaster, a brutal, shining solidarity could appear. When a wall collapsed, 100 strangers would dig with their bare hands to reach the buried. When a riot turned truly murderous, people would shield neighbors' children, pull strangers into doorways. The Subura was volatile, terrifying, and unforgiving, but it was also, in its own bloody way, fiercely protective of its own. Here, survival wasn't an individual sport. It was the only community law that mattered, forged in fire, fear, and an unbreakable will to see the next sunrise. For all its grime, its danger, its endless, exhausting noise, the Subura had something the polished marble districts of Rome would never understand: a soul. It wasn't built on aristocratic pride or imperial ceremony. It was built on raw human energy, unfiltered, relentless, real. The Subura was where Rome's heartbeat lived, at street level, where the empire's forgotten and its fiercest carved out a life in the cracks of the great city. Culture thrived here, not in libraries but in life itself. Storytelling happened in taverns over shared wine, where old men recounted epic gladiator fights and scandals whispered by drunk legionaries. Music, a wailing flute, a beaten drum, drifted from upper windows. Kids danced barefoot in alleyways, their game the only thing they owned. Languages crashed into each other. Latin tangled with Greek, Aramaic, the guttural tones of Gaul and Germania. In a single marketplace, you could hear 10 languages from across the empire, all in one heated argument over the price of olives. The Subura wasn't diverse by choice. Rome swallowed the world, and the world's discards washed up here, in its cheapest district. Faith was just as vibrant. Small shrines cluttered doorways, little statues of the Laras, household gods watching over families with nothing. Women left crumbs of bread or poured out a few drops of wine. Foreign cults found footholds here too: worship of Isis, Mithras, Yahweh. The Subura accepted any god who accepted the poor, the tired, the desperate. And from this hard ground, talent erupted. Actors, boxers, gladiators, healers, midwives, genius craftsmen, cooks who could make a feast from scraps. Many of Rome's most colorful, most resilient characters came from these tangled streets. Some clawed their way to fame. Most simply lived and died unnoticed, yet absolutely essential, supporting the vast, glorious weight of an empire from directly underneath its foundations. Your identity in the Subura wasn't about your ancestry. It was about your toughness, your street smarts, knowing which alley was a shortcut and which was a trap, knowing who to greet and who to cross the street to avoid, knowing how to stretch a single copper coin until it screamed. Families that survived generations here wore a fierce, proud scars. Suburanus was more than an address. It was a badge of honor, a personality forged in hardship. Rome's elite looked down from their hills and saw a pit of vice. But if the Subura vanished overnight, Rome would collapse. Its workers built the monuments, fed the markets, carried the water, hauled the stone. They whispered the rumors that toppled politicians. They were the muscle, the stomach, the restless conscience of the empire. The Subura was chaotic, dangerous, and exhausting. It was also completely, utterly irreplaceable. It was the dirty, roaring, magnificent truth of Rome. Let's pull back another layer. We've talked about kings and spies and grand conspiracies. But history has a basement level, a world that operated in the cracks, in the shadows of the official one. Before there was a Silk Road, there were the shadow roads. Before there were banks, there were men in back rooms with strongboxes and no questions asked. Every major city, every empire had a second circulatory system, a black market. And this wasn't just for luxury goods or illicit pleasures. This was often for the stuff of daily survival, traded outside the eyes of the taxman, the guild master, and the law. In medieval London, if the official grain stores were empty or priced beyond reach, you didn't just starve. You found the guy who knew the guy whose cousin pilfered sacks from the docks after dark. The price was higher, the quality questionable, but it was food. In Renaissance Venice, sumptuary laws forbade the middle class from wearing certain silks or jewels. So a vibrant underground trade sprang up in pre-owned finery and clever forgeries. A velvet gown that belonged to a noble aunt. A pearl necklace that was a family heirloom. These markets were ecosystems. They had their own guards, their own enforcers, their own codes. A smuggler moving salt, a heavily taxed necessity. Along the coast of France had to know which officials could be bribed, which coves were watched, and which rival gangs were moving wine on the same route. It was a high-risk, high-reward logistics network that mirrored the official one, but with daggers drawn. Often, the black market wasn't for illegal things, but for legal things sold illegally. Tax avoidance is a modern term. Back then, it was just smart business. A merchant might officially declare 1/10 of his cloth shipment, greasing a palm to get it through the gates, while the other 9/10 came in later, under cover of night, to be sold for pure profit. The crown lost its tariff, the merchant got rich, and the guard who looked the other way fed his family a little better that week. This shadow economy was a paradox. It was criminal, but it was also often the only thing that worked. When official supply chains broke down during a siege, a plague, or a bureaucratic mess, the black market kept people alive. It was resilient, adaptable, and brutally efficient. It proved a simple, timeless truth. Where there's a need, a market will appear. And if the law tries to block that market, the market will just go underground. When the law is slow, corrupt, or outright absent, people don't just become victims. They become their own judges, juries, and sometimes executioners. Across history, in neighborhoods from the Subura to the shantytowns outside industrial cities, unofficial justice systems arose. They weren't pretty, but they provided a kind of order where official order failed. In the slums of Victorian London, if a man was a known wife-beater or a serial thief preying on his own neighbors, he might not see a constable. But he might find himself ambushed in a dark alley by a group of men whose faces he couldn't see, receiving a talking to with brass knuckles. The message was clear: your behavior disrupts our peace. Stop, or the next visit will be worse. These systems often ran on reputation and community pressure. In tight-knit immigrant communities in 19th century New York, you didn't go to the Irish or Italian police captain who might be your enemy. You went to the neighborhood boss, the community elder, the gang leader who maintained a fragile peace. He would settle disputes over a debt, a damaged cart, a romantic slight, with a verdict that was enforced not by a court order, but by the threat of ostracism or violence. His authority wasn't legal. It was social and often more feared. This vigilante justice was a double-edged sword. It could protect the vulnerable from a predator the law ignored. But it was also capricious, vulnerable to bias, and could spiral into feuds. A judgment against you might mean your family's shop was mysteriously vandalized, or you were cut off from community loans and support. The punishment wasn't just a fine or jail time. It was exile from the only safety net you had. Yet, for many, this rough justice was preferable to the alternative: no justice at all. An official court was distant, expensive, and likely biased against the poor. The neighborhood's own system, for all its brutality, was at least run by people who understood the context, who lived with the consequences. It was a desperate, flawed mechanism for maintaining a shred of dignity and safety in places the law had abandoned. It whispered that even in the absence of a state, a society will find a way to govern itself, for better or for worse. Information has always been the most valuable currency, even before coins were minted. And in societies where official news was propaganda and literacy was rare, a specialized class emerged: the information brokers. These were the human routers of their day. In the bazaars of the Ottoman Empire, the coffeehouse owner was more than a server. He was a hub. He heard gossip from traders fresh from Persia, whispers from soldiers on leave, complaints from bureaucrats. A merchant looking to know if the route to Aleppo was safe from bandits, or if a certain pasha was falling out of favor, would spend hours and many cups of coffee in his establishment, casually probing and sharing in return. The coffeehouse owner traded in rumors, and his credibility was his stock in trade. In medieval monasteries, as we've seen, monks were intelligence analysts. But in the secular world, the role fell to people like messengers, minstrels, and pilgrims. A traveling minstrel wasn't just entertainment. He was a walking newspaper. He carried songs about far-off battles, scandals in royal courts, and satirical verses that hinted at popular discontent. A lord might pay him not just for a song, but for the unvarnished gossip he picked up in the last town. Pilgrims were another key network. On the roads to Canterbury, Rome, or Mecca, people from all walks of life mixed. A farmer, a knight, and a merchant, bound by faith, would talk. They'd share news of harvests, political unrest, and economic conditions across regions. This informal exchange was a vital lifeline of practical knowledge, forming a slow, human-powered internet. The most powerful brokers operated in royal courts. The courtier who had the king's ear, the noble's mistress who overheard plans, the servant who cleaned the ambassador's rooms. They all held pieces of the puzzle. They would sell these pieces, or trade them for favors, in a delicate, dangerous dance. Knowing that a certain duke was in debt could be leveraged. Hearing a hint of a planned marriage alliance could allow for financial speculation. These brokers created a shadow layer of intelligence that often ran parallel to, and was more accurate than, the official diplomatic channels. They proved that raw information is powerless. It only gains value when it moves from one person who doesn't need it to another who desperately does. In a world of uncertainty, the person who could reduce that uncertainty, even by a fraction, held real, if invisible, power. History loves stories of kings and rebels, of grand battles and declarations. But some of the most profound resistance never made the history books because it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, passive, and devastatingly effective. It was the resistance of the seemingly powerless. For enslaved people across the Americas, open rebellion was a suicide mission. So they resisted in ways that couldn't be easily punished. They worked slowly. They misunderstood orders. They broke tools accidentally. They feigned illness. They held on to their native languages and spiritual practices in secret, preserving a culture their owners tried to erase. Each act was a tiny defiance, a reclaiming of a shred of autonomy. Alone, it meant nothing. Collectively, it was a silent war of attrition that drained the efficiency and the profit from the oppressive system. In occupied territories during wars, civilians mastered this art. The French resistance had its heroes, but for every act of sabotage, there were 1,000 smaller ones. A shopkeeper forgetting to stock items for German soldiers, a railway worker misrouting a cargo train to cause delays, a housewife giving wrong directions. This was not fighting with guns, but with inconvenience, with bureaucratic sludge, with a collective unspoken no. Even in rigidly controlled societies like the Soviet bloc, this happened. Jokes about the regime became a form of currency and resistance. Circulating banned books through secret networks, samizdat, was an act of intellectual defiance. Gathering in apartments to listen to illegal radio broadcasts from the West was a way to maintain a connection to a forbidden world. The state could arrest a protester, but how do you arrest a smirk, a whispered joke, a copied poem passed hand to hand? This is the resilience of the human spirit under pressure. When you cannot fight the system head-on, you learn to subvert it. You find the cracks and you widen them, inch by inch, through non-cooperation, through preserving your mind and culture, through tiny acts of dignity. This quiet resistance doesn't topple governments in a day, but it erodes their authority, maintains the soul of the oppressed, and proves that total control is an impossible fantasy. The most powerful rebellion is sometimes the one that never raises a voice, but simply refuses, in 1,000 small ways, to comply. We end this dive into the shadows with perhaps the most universal hidden system of all: the economy of favors. This isn't about money changing hands. It's about social debt, obligation, and the invisible ledger that governs human relationships in the absence of formal safety nets. In a village where everyone is poor, cash is rare. So you pay in labor, in kind, and in promises. You help your neighbor rebuild his barn after a storm. You don't send him a bill. You write that labor into an invisible ledger. Now he owes you. When your wife is sick and you need someone to watch your children, you call in that favor. This isn't capitalism. It's social capitalism. Your wealth isn't in your purse. It's in the number of people who are indebted to you, and in the strength of your reputation as someone who pays their own debts. This system operated at the highest levels too. In the court of Louis XIV, a noble didn't just bribe a minister with gold. He would do the minister a discreet favor, secure a position for the minister's useless cousin, use his influence to squash a minor scandal. This created a bond of obligation far stronger and more subtle than a cash transaction. The currency was access, discretion, and influence. The economy of favors is built on trust and memory. It requires a society where people cannot easily disappear, where your reputation follows you. To violate this code, to receive a favor and not return it, or to publicly expose a private debt is social suicide. You are labeled untrustworthy, and the network closes its doors to you. In many ways, this hidden system is the glue that holds communities together, especially those failed by formal institutions. It's how the poor survive crises. It's how the powerful build unshakable alliances. It acknowledges a fundamental truth. Humans are not just economic creatures, but social ones. Our most valuable transactions often leave no paper trail, only a bond of mutual obligation that can be stronger than any contract. It's the original blockchain, a decentralized ledger of human trust, written not on servers, but in the collective memory of a community. And that is where our long journey ends. We've walked from the paranoid courts of medieval kings, through the silent spy networks of monks, into the perfumed dream of the floating world. We've marched with Alexander's impossible army and finally lost ourselves in the roaring, vital chaos of the Subura. If this kind of deep, story-driven dive into history is your thing, you know what to do. Smash that like button. Tells me this is what you want more of. And subscribe, because there's always another story, another hidden corner of the past waiting to be uncovered. Most importantly, talk to me in the comments. What era, what conspiracy, what lost city fascinates you? Your ideas fuel this channel. This isn't a lecture. It's a conversation. I read every single comment. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Now go out there and look at the world a little differently. History isn't just in books. It's in the stones under your feet, the shadows in the alley, and the quiet, forgotten truths waiting for someone to tell them. Until next time.